The PlayStation is in a bit of a rough spot right now. Following the PS5's best year ever, I would say this is going to be the high watermark point for the PS5 for sure, considering all the releases that came out this year. I think after this year, we are going to see a pretty steep decline in the relevancy of the PlayStation 5 because this, which was supposed to be a big year with a bunch of major releases, was a disaster for PlayStation. Everything from Final Fantasy 16 to Street Fighter 6 to Diablo 4 has all flat on its face, has all fallen flat on its face, and really failed to keep itself relevant in any way, shape, or form. There are, of course, dozens of examples of major games that have come out and completely flopped, notorious ones like Forspoken. But what it all comes down to is that PlayStation just simply isn't viable anymore, to the point where some of the most notorious PlayStation fanboys I know have instead resorted to hyping up Baldur's Gate 3 and The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered as major PlayStation releases for the year because they simply have nothing else. When you get right down to it, the audience is starving for content, starving. They've been stuck in the desert for 40 days and 40 nights, like drinking nothing but old old re-releases of PS3 games, right? These are the guys who are getting excited over upgrading The Last of Us Part 2 for $10, right? Just not even eating scraps at this point. They're just drinking their own piss to keep themselves hydrated. They are disgusting human beings. And it's getting worse and worse every year, right? It is getting worse because the releases are becoming fewer and further are few and far between, and the ones that do come out are underwhelming and disappointing to the point where all of these games that were supposed to stop the not talked about Tears of the Kingdom, right? Games like Final Fantasy 16 and Street Fighter 6 and Diablo 4, like all of this stuff has failed, right? To stay relevant. Like I would not be surprised if Tears of the Kingdom has sold more than Final Fantasy 16, Forspoken, and Street Fighter 6 combined, right? And of course, these are completely different games, and there's nothing wrong with games doing not as well as other games, but when you look at the bigger picture here, like these are the companies that have spent the past 25 years trying to drive Nintendo out of the hardware space, trying to make them become bankrupt, trying to pretend as if their games are irrelevant or that they aren't popular and that nobody cares about them. Like just look at what happened this year. Release after release after release, which was just like all of which were high quality, exceedingly well made, interesting games that generated a lot of fan praise and just acclaim that were just endlessly fun and replayable. Fire Emblem Engage, Cereza and the Lost Demon, Tears of the Kingdom, Super Mario Bros. Wonder. Like all of these great games come out. And the industry tried to do everything they possibly could to downplay them, right? That is the narrative we hear about like every time that Tears of the Kingdom is brought up is that like, oh, nobody talks about it. But we are talking about it. The fact that you have to keep reminding people that nobody is talking about it is in and of itself an admission that people are talking about it because the people who are saying that nobody is talking about it, are talking about it. It is an inherent contradiction. It makes no sense, right? And the game is 6 months old now and has maintained its relevancy more than Starfield, than Baldur's Gate 3, than Final Fantasy 16. Like all these games that were supposed to be major hitters. Like it's remained more relevant than Spider-Man 2, and that just came out like a month ago, right? Like where is this thinking that Tears of the Kingdom is irrelevant? This is a game that is going to be talked about and enjoyed for a long time. Like the worst thing anybody has to say about it is that it's a direct sequel to Breath of the Wild and all the problems that causes. But it's like the Majora's Mask thing again. It's like the Wind Waker thing again. When you complain about a game being too different or being too cartoonish, like when they make changes for the next game, your complaints aren't going to hold water. And everything you spent so much time building up, the narratives about how like Zelda is outdated and that it doesn't innovate and that nobody wants puzzles and that Dark Souls is way more difficult and that like there's just so many better games out there. Like because of your stringent, just obsessive compulsion to downplay the Ocarina era of Zelda. Ocarina, Majora, Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, Skyward, like all of these great games, right? Because of your compulsive obsession in downplaying that era, that led to Breath of the Wild. That led to Nintendo addressing these problems that people saw in the franchise, with people not wanting to deal with the dungeon crawling and the adventuring and stuff like that. And they made something completely new and different that appeals to a wider audience. And now that Breath of the Wild is these new Zelda games are establishing themselves as mega hits in their own right, games that can legit compete with Pokemon, like huge heavy hitters. Like we're seeing people desperately trying to do whatever they can to downplay them, desperately trying to find something they can do to hold something against Nintendo, whether it's like the visual quality or the console it's on, or like what you do in the game, or alleged similarities to other games. Like you are going to see people coming out every time, coming out against every single Nintendo product. I have seen people come out against WarioWare Move It. I have seen people cry about Detective Pikachu Returns. I have seen people complain about Super Mario RPG. Like all of these great games that have come out in the past couple of weeks have just been like really attacked by the community, by the industry, out of like some naive bid to destroy Nintendo, but it simply isn't going to work. Like it's not going to stick long term. I remember Get It Together, WarioWare Get It Together being downplayed when that came out. And now, a couple of years later, people are saying that game was way better than Move It. And it's not true, right? I'm still seeing people like try to say that like the motion controls in Move It don't work properly, which isn't true at all. Just like they tried to say that for Skyward Sword and Star Fox Zero, which also isn't true. Like, how you cannot build your narrative on statements that simply aren't true. And that is the problem that a lot of these people are having now, is that more people than ever are playing the Nintendo games and realizing that, like, wow, Pokemon does innovate with each entry. Zelda does have a great open world setting. 2D Mario games, even though I've never played a 2D platformer in my life, are actually a lot of fun, even though the entire industry has told me that it's a stale, derivative, uninspired genre. Like, I know people who went into Mario Wonder not expecting once and not expecting much, and just came away from it from just like this amazing experience, right? Who just came away with this just, a, and became a fan of the Mario brand, became a fan of 2D Mario. And, although I agree that Mario Wonder is something special and is on like a whole other level compared to other classic 2D Mario games, I think it's better than 3. I think it's better than One World. I think it's better than the new Super Mario Bros. Games. Like, I think it's better than 3D games. Like, I think Wonder is one of the best Mario games ever made, right? Way better than Odyssey, right? Like, the misconceptions that people put out about 2D Mario have been completely demolished with this one release, right? More people than ever are becoming fans of the Mario brand. This is a brand that's been attacked for for decades now. You can still find those Crash Bandicoot guys. They'll talk about this in interviews and stuff. They'll come out and try to say that Crash Bandicoot outsold Mario. Well, okay, but why isn't Crash relevant now? Why does nobody remember games outside the original trilogy? Why didn't you keep making them after the third game? Why why is the IP like completely dead and buried now? While Mario is still, reaching new heights and innovating and doing new things. Like, because Crash was never bigger than Mario. PlayStation was never more popular than Nintendo. Like, what has happened? All they did was just gaslight a generation of people into thinking that Nintendo games weren't fun or compelling. And more, as the audience is exposed to old and new games alike, people are beginning to realize that's not actually true, right? And it is like kind of a gradual process, but like it's crazy. I grew up in that era where a lot of 2D Mario games, like the new Super Mario Bros. Came out, right? Huge deal, right? And I remember like just having the time of my life playing this game, sharing it with friends. Like, it's probably one of the most popular games I ever owned with other people, right? Like, I had a blast with that game, right? It was really important to me. But like the plebs, people would try to tell you that it's not a good game, right? It's just a 2D platformer. You shouldn't be interested in this kind of stuff. And it's never really worked. It just made me resent that mindset. It just made me resent those kind of people. It just made me resent the narrative, right? And that led me to where I am now, where I'm like openly talking about this. That like, yeah, the narrative that PlayStation is better than Nintendo is nothing more than a farce, right? It is an illusion, right? And we aren't going to be fooled by illusions anymore, right? Like this is the current state of the gaming industry where it's becoming harder and harder to downplay the Nintendo games, downplaying Fire Emblem, downplaying the remakes, downplaying 2D platformers, downplaying Zelda, right? Like downplaying the handheld exclusive stuff like Pokemon, like the industry is scrambling trying to find something to hold against Nintendo. Like right now, they're trying to tell people that they're on the verge of replacing the Switch, and that the next console won't be as successful as the Switch was. But that's not going to work either, right? Like the uh, the illusion has crumbled, right? Like no matter what happens at the Game Awards this year, no matter what happens with like the industry, no matter what they try to push, like what they try to do, like Spider-Man is not going to be remembered. God of War Ragnarok has not been remembered. I know plenty of people who tried putting it out there as a Game of the Year contender last year, right? I remember like nobody is going to remember a lot of these like major releases that come out this year. Like Alan Wake just came out, and I don't know a single person who's played it. All right. Like so many people are hyping that up as a big deal, but it's just nothing spectacular, right? It's just a complete joke, right? And what that amounts to, we are seeing like the dying throes of PlayStation. All right, we're trying to see them like utilize the same tricks, try to utilize the same resources, try to utilize the same rhetoric. Try and like milk The Last of Us dry. Trying to do like everything they possibly can. But the reality is that Nintendo is simply better, and the only thing keeping keeping that image away from like the masses, from the general population, is just the stigma that's PlayStation set in the 90s, utilizing the gaming media as a weapon, against like unsuspecting gamers, like tricking you, convincing you that like, oh, these experienced gamers who know what they're talking about, who have careers in gaming journalism, overwhelmingly prefer Sony over Sega and Nintendo, right? So that means PlayStation is better, right? But if you don't actually play the games yourself, like until you actually play the games yourself, actually like understand what's going on, understand like the perspectives of what's happening, like you're never going to become enlightened to the fact that like it is, as I've said, an illusion, right? No matter what happens at the Game Awards this year, nobody is going to remember or talk about anything other than the Nintendo games.